The great hall of the Galactic Concord was a cathedral of light and silence, a place where the fates of entire civilizations were decided with the raise of a hand or the press of a button. 42 species sat in their assigned stations, each one representing billions of lives across hundreds of worlds. And today, every single one of them was about to prove that power and wisdom were not the same thing. Ambassador Lithia of the Velnari stood at the central podium, her translucent skin flickering with a pale blue glow that was barely visible under the harsh chamber lights, and she was trying very hard not to collapse. She was small, even by Velnari standards, barely 4 feet tall, with enormous dark eyes that reflected the faces of every delegate staring down at her, and her thin fingers gripped the edge of the podium because her legs had started to tremble 3 minutes ago and had not stopped. The Velnari were not built for confrontation. They came from Shale Mora, a water world of deep oceans and bioluminescent forests that grew beneath the waves, and for as long as anyone could remember, they had been the gentlest species in the known galaxy. They had no claws, no venom, no armored skin, no psionic weapons, and no military fleet worth mentioning. What they had was something far more rare and far more valuable. They could feel the emotions of every living being around them, and their presence alone could ease suffering, calm rage, and heal the invisible wounds that no medicine could touch. For centuries, the Velnari had served the Concord as mediators, as healers, as the quiet voice in the room that reminded warriors and politicians alike that the people they governed were more than numbers on a screen. Every great peace treaty in the last 400 years had a Velnari standing in the room when it was signed. And every war that had been prevented before it started had a Velnari, whispering the right words to the right people at the right time. They were loved, or at least they had been loved, back when they were useful. Lithia opened her mouth and spoke, and her voice carried the weight of a dying world. "The hollow tide has taken 30% of our population," she said, and the words echoed through the chamber like a funeral bell. "It does not kill the body, but it kills everything else. Our empathic gift, our awareness, our ability to feel and to connect. It leaves our people alive, but empty, like vessels drained of everything that made them who they were." She paused, because she could feel the emotions in the room, and what she felt made her want to scream. Boredom from the Draelith delegation, cold calculation from the Korvathi hive speakers, mild discomfort from the Tassari, who at least had the decency to feel something resembling guilt, and from most of the others, a dull gray indifference that pressed against her mind, like wet stone. "We are asking for aid," Lithia continued, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Medical resources to study the parasite and develop a cure, shelter for the refugees who have lost their homes, and protection for our remaining colonies which cannot defend themselves." She looked around the chamber, searching for a single face that showed compassion, and she found very few. The Draelith ambassador, a towering reptilian figure covered in iridescent scales, was the first to respond, and he did not bother to stand. "The Velnari crisis is regrettable," he said in a voice that made it clear he did not find it regrettable at all. "But the Imperium cannot justify the expenditure of resources on a species that can no longer fulfill its role within the Concord. You were our mediators, our empaths, our emotional translators, and now that gift is fading. What exactly would we be investing in?" Lithia felt the words like a blade between her ribs, but she did not flinch because she had expected this from the Draelith. What she had not expected was the Korvathi. The Korvathi hive speaker rose from its station, a segmented insectoid creature with multifaceted eyes that reflected the light in fractured rainbows, and it spoke in the buzzing harmonic voice of its collective. "Natural selection is not cruelty," the Korvathi said. "It is simply truth. The hollow tide is performing a function that evolution would have performed eventually. The weak are being removed so that the strong may continue. This is not a tragedy, it is a correction. A murmur passed through the chamber, and Lythea realized with dawning horror that most of the delegates were nodding. One by one they spoke, and one by one they said no. The Moravan said they could not risk exposure to the parasite, even though every scientific report confirmed it was non-contagious to other species. The Thessari said they sympathized, but could not act unilaterally without a Concord mandate. The Jareli said they would pray for the Velnari, which was their way of saying they would do absolutely nothing. 41 species looked at a dying people and decided that helping them was not worth the trouble. The vote was called, and the result was displayed on the central screen for everyone to see. 41 votes to classify the Velnari crisis as an internal species matter, which meant the Concord would offer no assistance, no protection, and no acknowledgement that anything wrong was happening at all. 1 vote against. Lythea stared at the screen and felt the last flicker of hope inside her chest gutter and almost die. And then she turned to look at the single dissenting delegation. The humans. They sat in the far corner of the chamber because they were the newest members and had been given the worst seats. And there were only 3 of them compared to the dozens that other species sent. Woman at the center of their delegation was standing, and she was furious. Ambassador Elena Vasquez was not tall, and she was not physically imposing, but when she was angry, she filled a room in a way that had nothing to do with size. Lythea could feel her emotions from across the chamber, and they hit her like a wave. Not the cold indifference of the others, not the calculated cruelty of the Korvathi, but a blazing white-hot fury that burned so bright it almost hurt to feel. "Let the record show," Elena said, and her voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a knife, "that Earth voted no, and let the record show that every other species in this chamber just proved that the Velnari were right to trust us, and wrong to trust you." No one responded, because no one knew what to say to a species that had only been in the Concord for 90 years, and had somehow decided it had the right to lecture civilizations that were older than human agriculture. Chamber emptied slowly after that. Delegates filing out in groups, already forgetting the vote and the small glowing woman who had begged them for help. Lythea remained at the podium because she did not have the strength to move, and the glow beneath her skin had dimmed to almost nothing, which happened to Velnari when grief became too heavy to carry. She heard footsteps approaching, and looked up to find Ambassador Vasquez standing in front of her. And the human woman's anger had not faded, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a wildfire, but a forge, something hot and controlled and purposeful. "How many of your people need evacuation?" Elena asked, and it was not a question born of curiosity, but of planning. Lythea blinked. "Millions, but we have nowhere to go, and no ships to carry them, and no one willing to take them in." Elena looked at her for a long moment, and Lythea felt something in the human's emotions that she had never felt from any alien species before. A deep and stubborn refusal to accept that the situation was hopeless. A burning defiance that seemed to say the universe could go to hell before this woman would stand by and watch people die. "Pack what you can," Elena said. "We are coming to get your people." And she meant it, every single word. The fleet launched from Earth's orbital shipyards on a Tuesday morning, and it was the largest humanitarian deployment in human history. 200 ships burning hard across the black. Medical frigates loaded with supplies that had been pulled from hospitals on 6 different colonies. Transport vessels designed to carry thousands of refugees in conditions that were at least survivable, if not comfortable. And at the edges of the formation, a ring of warships that carried enough firepower to make anyone with bad intentions think twice. Fleet Admiral Roshan Cade stood on the bridge of the UCS Resolve and watched the stars stretch into lines as the fleet jumped to faster-than-light speed. And he thought about the fact that half the politicians back on Earth wanted him court-martialed for this. He was 63 years old, with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone by someone who was not very good at carving. And he had fought in the Fringe Wars when humanity was still learning how to survive in a galaxy that did not particularly want them around. He had seen enough suffering to last several lifetimes, and he had made a decision a long time ago that he would not add to it if he could help it. Reduced to blank emptiness, while their bodies continued to breathe. "How many?" he asked his intelligence officer, Commander Prionaire. "Current estimates put the affected population at somewhere between 8 and 12 million, she said, and her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "The remaining population is concentrated in the northern archipelago platforms, approximately 20 million Velnari in an area designed to hold 5 million. Cade closed his eyes for a moment, and then opened them again, because closing his eyes did not make the numbers smaller. "Get the medical teams down there now," he said. "Every shuttle we have. I want boots on those platforms within the hour." The first human medical teams arrived on the refugee platforms and walked into a nightmare. The Velnari were everywhere, huddled in corridors, pressed against walls, sitting in shallow water that had risen because the city's systems were failing without enough people to maintain them. And among the living were the hollow, Velnari who had been taken by the parasite, who sat or stood or lay with their eyes open and their skin completely dark, no bioluminescence at all, no light, no recognition, no sign that anyone was home behind those enormous empty eyes. A human medic named Corporal James Okoro knelt beside a Velnari child who was curled up next to one of the hollow, and he realized after a moment that the hollow was the child's mother. The child looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes that still carried a faint blue glow, and Okoro did not speak the Velnari language, and the child did not speak English. But he held out his hand, and the child took it, and that was enough. Across the platforms, scenes like this played out 1,000 times over, human soldiers and medics and engineers stepping into the worst disaster they had ever seen, and doing what humans had always done in the face of impossible suffering. Up their sleeves and get to work. Dr. Marin Holt arrived on Shale Mora with the second wave of ships, and she was not there to treat patients. She was there to find answers. Holt was a xenobiologist, one of the best in human space, a small woman with sharp eyes and a mind that moved faster than most people could follow. And she had been studying the hollow-tide parasite from samples sent to Earth for weeks. Something about it bothered her, something she could not quite name, and she needed to see it in its natural environment to understand what was wrong. She set up a laboratory on the largest refugee platform and began working 18-hour days, pulling apart the parasite's genetic code, strand by strand, comparing it against every known biological organism in the galactic database. On the 9th day, she found what she was looking for, and it made her blood run cold. The hollow-tide was not natural. Its genetic structure contained sequences that did not occur in nature. Deliberate insertions, engineered proteins, molecular signatures that could only have been created in a laboratory by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone had designed this parasite specifically to target the Velnari empathic system, and they had designed it to be permanent. Holt sat alone in her lab at 3 in the morning and stared at her data, and felt a kind of anger she had not felt since she was a child, watching the news and learning for the first time that people could be deliberately cruel. She compiled her findings into a report and brought it to Admiral Cade personally, and when he read it, his face did something that his crew had never seen before. It went completely blank, which was worse than anger, because it meant he was thinking about things that required very careful consideration. "You are telling me," he said slowly, "that someone built this thing on purpose?" "Yes, sir," Holt replied, "and I can narrow down who." The molecular engineering techniques used in the parasite match the biotech capabilities of exactly 3 Concord species, and one of them had a very clear motive. Meanwhile, the Galactic Concord had not been idle. A formal communication arrived from the Concord's administrative body, informing Earth that their intervention in Velnari space was a violation of the non-interference clause of the Concord Charter, and that continued presence would result in sanctions. Ambassador Vasquez read the communication in her office on the Resolve, and then she did something that made every diplomat in the galaxy choke on their morning beverages. She broadcast her response on the Open Galactic Network, which meant every species with a receiver could hear it. "You do not get to define abandonment as policy and call it law," she said, looking directly into the camera with eyes that could have melted steel. 41 species watched a helpless people begin to die, and decided it was not their problem. You do not get to tell the one species that showed up that we are breaking the rules. Your rules protected no one, and we will not follow rules that exist only to make cowardice convenient. The broadcast spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass, and reactions were immediate and divided. Some species were outraged at humanity's arrogance. Who were these newcomers to lecture ancient civilizations about morality? Others were quietly uncomfortable because deep down they knew the human ambassador was right, and being confronted with that knowledge in public was deeply unpleasant. And on the refugee platforms of Shale Mora, the Velnari watched the broadcast with something they had not felt in months. Lythea stood among her people as the human ambassador's words echoed through the crowded corridors, and she reached out with her empathic sense toward the humans around her, who had dropped everything to come to a dying world for a species they had never met. What she felt in them amazed her. Every other species Lythea had ever read carried emotions that were organized, structured, predictable. The Dralith felt in sharp geometric patterns, the Thessari in slow rolling waves, the Korvathi barely felt at all. Humans were chaos. Their emotions were a storm of contradictions. They were exhausted but refused to rest. They were afraid but refused to leave. They were angry at the galaxy and heartbroken for the Velnari. And somehow, underneath all of that, was a stubborn, burning thing that Lythea could only describe as a refusal to accept that the situation was hopeless. She had felt empathy from other species before, but it was always measured and conditional. Human compassion was different. It was reckless and irrational, and it burned like a star that was willing to consume itself just to keep shining. Advisors that evening, and told them what she had felt, and she used a phrase that would become famous among the Velnari in the years to come. "They are a fire that burns itself to keep others warm," she said, "and they do not seem to care." Back on the Resolve, Admiral Cade sat in his quarters reading Dr. Holt's report for the third time, and the weight of what it contained pressed against his chest like an anchor. The hollow tide had not come from nature. It had come from politics. And if that was true, then everything about this crisis was different than the galaxy believed. And the question was no longer how to save the Velnari, but who had tried to destroy them, and why. He set the report down and looked out the viewport at the dark ocean world below, where human lights now dotted the surface like stars reflected in water, and he made a decision that would change the galaxy forever. So it was not nature that did this to them. Empty room. It was politics. And Roshan Cade had never lost a political fight he was willing to bleed for. Dr. Marin Holt spent 3 more weeks buried in her laboratory on Shale Mora, and by the end of it, she had built a case so airtight that not even the most skilled diplomat in the galaxy could argue with it. The hollow-tide parasite had been engineered by the Korvathi Collective. The evidence was written into the parasite's genetic code like a signature, specific protein folding techniques that only Korvathi bioengineers used, molecular markers that matched Korvathi laboratory equipment, and a targeting mechanism so precisely calibrated to the Velnari empathic system that it could only have been designed by someone with deep and detailed knowledge of Velnari neurology. The kind of knowledge the Korvathi had access to, because the Velnari had trusted them as allies for over 300 years. When Holt presented her complete findings to Admiral Cade and Ambassador Vasquez in a secure briefing room aboard the Resolve, the room was silent for a very long time. "Why?" Vasquez finally asked, and it was not a rhetorical question. Holt pulled up a timeline on the display screen. The Velnari empathic ability is not just a gift for healing, it is essentially a living lie detector. Every time a Velnari is present in a negotiation, they can feel when someone is being deceptive, when someone is manipulating, when someone is hiding their true intentions behind diplomatic language. She pointed to a series of Concord votes over the past 50 years. The Korvathi have been expanding their influence within the Concord for decades, buying votes, making backdoor deals, pressuring smaller species into compliance. And every single time they tried to push through something particularly corrupt, a Velnari mediator flagged it. The Velnari were the only species that could consistently detect Korvathi deception, Cade said, and it was not a question because he had already connected the pieces. The Hollow Tide was not designed to kill the Velnari. It was designed to remove their empathic ability. Without it, the Velnari are just another small species with no military and no political power. And the Korvathi can do whatever they want, without anyone sensing the lies. Cade leaned back in his chair and considered the situation with the cold calculation of a man who had spent 40 years thinking about war. If they revealed this information publicly, the Concord could fracture. Species would take sides, alliances would shift, and Earth would be standing at the center of a galactic political earthquake with a target painted on its back. If they stayed silent, the Velnari would continue to fade, the Korvathi would continue to expand, and the precedent would be set that you could engineer a biological weapon against an entire species and get away with it, as long as you had enough friends. It was not really a choice at all, but the timing had to be. "We are not ready to go public yet," Cade said. "We need more than evidence. We need allies. We need the Velnari safe, and we need a position strong enough that the Korvathi cannot simply crush us when the truth comes out." And so began the second phase of Operation Iron Cradle. The United Earth Coalition identified a moon called Haven in a star system under human control, a world that had been recently terraformed and was almost entirely covered in shallow warm oceans, which made it nearly perfect for Velnari habitation. Human engineers descended on Haven like an army of builders, and began reshaping the entire moon to accommodate Velnari refugees, adjusting the salinity of the oceans to match shale mora, installing bioluminescent lighting systems that mimicked the Velnari homeworld's underwater forests, building floating habitation platforms that could house millions. The work was enormous and expensive, and it stretched human resources to their limits. Absolute limit, but nobody stopped. Transport ships began ferrying Velnari from Shale Mora to Haven in waves, thousands at a time, packed into ships that were designed for cargo, but had been hastily refitted with water tanks and pressure systems to keep the Velnari alive during transit. It was not comfortable, and it was not dignified, but it was survival, and the Velnari accepted it with a gratitude that broke the hearts of every human crew member who witnessed it. To offer in return. On Haven, something unexpected began to happen. Human families had been assigned to the settlement to help with the transition, and their children were the first to make contact with the Velnari young. Human children, it turned out, did not care about galactic politics, or species classifications, or the proper diplomatic protocols for interspecies interaction. They cared about the fact that the Velnari kids glowed in the dark, which was the coolest thing they had ever seen, and the Velnari kids cared about the fact that human children laughed louder than any sound they had ever heard, which was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. Friendships formed with the speed that only children are capable of, and through those friendships, a cultural exchange began that would reshape both species. The Velnari taught the human children about emotional awareness, how to recognize what they were feeling, how to sit with difficult emotions without running from them, how to listen to another person not just with ears, but with the heart. And the humans taught the Velnari something they had never needed before and now desperately required: how to fight. Not with weapons, because the Velnari would never be warriors in the physical sense, but with everything else. Human advisors taught them institutional resilience, how to build systems that could survive attacks on their leadership, how to create redundancies so that no single failure could bring everything crashing down. They taught them legal strategy, how to use the Concord's own rules as weapons, how to build cases that could not be dismissed, how to turn bureaucracy from a shield for the powerful into a sword for the weak. They taught them media warfare, how to tell their story in a way that the galaxy could not ignore, how to make indifference shameful and cruelty visible. And they taught them the most human skill of all, one that had carried humanity through ice ages and plagues and wars and every other catastrophe that should have destroyed them: the art of surviving when everything was against you. A new generation of Velnari began to emerge on Haven, young ones who had grown up alongside humans and who carried something in their eyes that no Velnari had ever carried before. They called themselves the Ashborn, named after the human myth of the Phoenix, a creature that burns to ash and then rises again, reborn from its own destruction. The Ashborn retained their empathic abilities, those who had not been touched by the hollow tide, but they paired those abilities with human strategic thinking in a combination that was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. They could walk into a room and feel every emotion, detect every lie, read every hidden intention, and then use that information not just to heal, but to outmaneuver, outthink, and outplay anyone who stood against them. They were diplomats who could dismantle an argument while simultaneously reading the emotional state of everyone in the room, and they were terrifying in the most elegant way possible. But the Korvathi were watching, and they were not fools. Intelligence reports began filtering back to Admiral Cade that the Korvathi were aware humanity had been studying the hollow tide, and they were nervous. Nervous enough to act. The first blow came not as a weapon, but as a vote. The Korvathi pressured their allies within the Concord to impose a full economic blockade on human space, cutting off trade routes that Earth's outer colonies depended on for food and raw materials. The effect was immediate and devastating. Prices on human colony worlds tripled overnight. Supply chains that had taken decades to build collapsed in weeks, and on 3 outer worlds, the word famine began to appear in government reports. Back on Earth, protests erupted against the Korvathi, because most humans did not know about the conspiracy yet, but against the UEC government for spending billions on alien refugees while human colonies starved. News screens filled with angry faces and shouting voices, demanding to know why Earth was sacrificing its own people for a species that most humans had never heard of 6 months ago. Admiral Cade watched the protests from his quarters on Haven, and felt the weight of command press down on him harder than it ever had before, because he knew the truth that the protesters did not, that this was not about charity, it was about justice, and if they walked away now, the Korvathi would have proven that you could destroy an innocent species and the galaxy would let you. Lithia found him there, staring at a screen showing a crowd on Earth burning a Velnari flag that someone had made, and she felt his emotions so clearly that she almost staggered. Exhaustion and doubt and fury, and beneath all of it, that same impossible stubborn fire that she had come to associate with every human she had ever met. "Your people are suffering because of us," she said quietly. "Why do you stay?" Admiral Cade looked at her, and his face was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix. But his eyes were steady. "Because the day we stop helping someone because it is hard, is the day we stop being worth a damn," he said. And Lythea believed him, because she could feel that he meant it with every cell in his body. The blockade was strangling humanity, and everyone knew it. 3 outer colonies had declared food emergencies, supply convoys were being turned back at Concord-controlled transit points, and the economic damage was mounting so fast that the UEC Treasury Department had stopped issuing daily reports because the numbers were too frightening to publish. On Earth, the Parliament convened an emergency session to vote on the future of Operation Iron Cradle, and the chamber was full of angry voices and frightened faces and the particular kind of moral cowardice that disguises itself as pragmatism. Admiral Roshan Cade was recalled from Haven to testify, and he made the journey alone because he wanted time to think. And what he was thinking about was the kind of decision that could not be undone once it was made. He arrived on Earth and was escorted to the parliamentary chamber, where 500 elected representatives sat in tiered rows looking down at him. Judges, and the gallery above was packed with journalists and citizens who wanted to watch the man responsible for their suffering explain himself. The Speaker of Parliament opened the session with a statement that was designed to sound neutral, but carried the unmistakable tone of someone who had already made up their mind. Admiral Cade, the people of Earth demand to know whether the continued expenditure of resources on the Velnari crisis is justified, given the severe economic impact on human worlds. You may present your case. Cade stood at the podium in his dress uniform and looked out at the sea of faces, and felt absolutely nothing like fear, because fear was a luxury he had given up decades ago. He had 2 options. The first was to defend the mission on moral grounds, to make an emotional appeal about compassion and duty and doing what was right, and he knew with absolute certainty that this approach would fail, because hungry people do not want to hear about morality. They want to hear about solutions. The second option was the one he had been preparing for since the moment Dr. Holt had shown him the evidence on Shale Mora. And it was the kind of move that would either save everything or burn it all to the ground. He chose the second option. "Members of Parliament," he said, and his voice was calm in the way that a loaded weapon is calm. "I am not here to ask you to continue this mission out of compassion. I am here to show you why stopping it would be the greatest strategic mistake in human history." He pressed a control on the podium, and the main display screen behind him lit up. But it was not broadcasting to the parliamentary chamber alone. Admiral Cade had arranged, through channels that Ambassador Vasquez had quietly opened over the past several weeks, for his testimony to be carried live on the open galactic network. Every species with a receiver was watching. Confusion. But Cade kept talking, because once the broadcast was live, there was no taking it back. 6 months ago, the Galactic Concord classified the Velnari crisis as a natural disaster, and voted to offer no assistance, he said. 41 species accepted that classification without question. Today, I am going to show you and the entire galaxy why that classification was a lie. He brought up Dr. Holt's research on the screen, the genetic analysis of the holotide parasite displayed in clear, simple graphics that anyone could understand. The engineered protein sequences highlighted in red, the molecular signatures matched against known Korvathi bioengineering techniques, the timeline of Korvathi political maneuvers that the Velnari empathic abilities had disrupted. The holotide was not a natural parasite, Cade said, and his words carried across 1,000 worlds. It was a biological weapon designed and deployed by the Korvathi collective to destroy the Velnari people. Velnari empathic ability. Not to kill them, but to silence them. Because the Velnari were the only species in the Concord capable of detecting Korvathi deception. He let that sink in for 3 seconds, which was exactly the right amount of time. The Korvathi did not just attack the Velnari. They attacked every species in this Concord. Because without the Velnari to detect their lies, no one can trust that any deal made with the Korvathi is honest. No one can trust that any vote in the Concord chamber is free from manipulation. And no one can trust that what happened to the Velnari will not happen to them next. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Cade had ever heard. On 100 worlds, billions of beings watched the evidence unfold on their screens and felt something shift beneath them. The comfortable certainty that the Velnari crisis was someone else's problem, cracking like ice on a warming river. The reaction was immediate, massive. The Thessari Republic, one of the oldest and most respected civilizations in the Concord, issued a formal statement within the hour condemning the Korvathi and pledging medical and economic aid to the Velnari, the first non-human species to stand beside Earth since the crisis began. 3 smaller species withdrew from the Concord entirely, declaring that they could not remain in an alliance that harbored a species guilty of biological warfare. 6 others issued statements demanding an independent investigation. And on Earth, the parliamentary vote to cancel Operation Iron Cradle was quietly tabled, because it is very difficult to vote to abandon genocide victims on live television when the galaxy is watching. But the Korvathi were not the kind of species that surrendered when cornered. They were the kind that attacked. Within 72 hours of Cade's broadcast, Korvathi war fleets began mobilizing, not toward Earth, which was too far away and too well defended, but toward Haven, the small ocean moon where 20 million Velnari refugees had built their new home. The message was clear. If the Korvathi could not silence the truth, they would destroy the evidence. Admiral Cade received the intelligence report on the bridge of the Resolve as the ship burned hard back toward Haven, and the numbers were not good. The Korvathi were sending 300 warships, fast, heavily armed, and crewed by a hive mind that could coordinate fleet movements with a precision that no individual species could match. Cade had 67 combat-capable ships remaining from the original fleet, plus whatever the Thessari could send, which would not arrive in time. He was outnumbered more than 3 to 1, defending a moon full of civilians who could not be evacuated in time, with a fleet that was exhausted and undersupplied from months of humanitarian operations. He gathered his senior officers and told them the truth without decoration, because they deserved that much. The Korvathi fleet will arrive at Haven in approximately 40 hours, he said. We cannot win this fight on numbers. We will win it on stubbornness, and the fact that we are defending people who have already lost everything, and we will not let them lose anything more. On Haven, the news of the incoming fleet spread through the Velnari population like a shockwave, and for a terrible moment, Lithia felt the collective despair of her people press against her mind so hard she could barely breathe. But then something happened that surprised even her. The Ashborn, the young Velnari who had been raised alongside humans, who had learned the art of defiance from a species that had made defiance into a way of life, the Ashborn refused to evacuate. They came to Lithia in groups, their bioluminescent skin blazing with a fierce light that she had never seen in Velnari before, and they told her that they would not run. We have run enough, said a young Ashborn named Ven, whose glow was the color of deep ocean fire. The humans taught us that there are things worth standing for. Our home is one of them. Lithia looked at these young people who were so different from every generation of Velnari that had come before them, and she felt their emotions, not the gentle flowing calm of traditional Velnari, but something harder and brighter, something that burned. She recognized it because she had felt it 100 times in the humans around her. It was defiance, and it was beautiful. The battle began at dawn Haven time, when the Korvathi fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a perfect geometric formation that reflected their hive-mind coordination. Admiral Cade's fleet met them in orbit, 67 ships against 300, and what followed was the most desperate naval engagement in human history. The humans fought the way humans had always fought when outnumbered and outgunned, not with elegance or precision, but with a chaotic, adaptive ferocity that the Korvathi hive mind could not predict, because it did not follow any logical pattern. Ships broke formation and regrouped in configurations that made no tactical sense, until suddenly they did, attacking from angles that the Korvathi strategic algorithms had classified as irrational and therefore had not defended against. And on Haven's surface, the Ashborn did something unprecedented. They linked their empathic abilities together into a network that could sense the emotional state of the Korvathi hive mind in real time, feeling the shifts in collective intention microseconds before they translated into fleet movements, and feeding that information directly to the human tactical officers. For the first time in history, two species fought as a single organism, human aggression guided by Velnari perception, and it was devastating. Was not enough. The Korvathi had too many ships, and they were pushing through the human lines with relentless mechanical efficiency, and Cade could feel the battle slipping away. Then the sensors screamed. A massive fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel behind the Korvathi formation, Thessari warships, ancient and enormous, their hulls covered in the living crystal armor that had made them legends. And behind them came the Moravan, and behind them came the Jareli, and behind them came three more species whose names Cade had never bothered to learn, but whose guns he was suddenly very grateful for. The galaxy had been watching, and enough of it had decided to stop watching and start acting. The Korvathi fleet, caught between the human hammer and the allied anvil, broke formation for the first time in recorded history. The hive mind overwhelmed by too many threats from too many directions, and began to retreat. As the last Korvathi ships fled into the dark between stars, Lithia stood on the surface of Haven and watched trails of fire streak across the sky, debris from the battle burning up in the atmosphere like falling stars. Her bioluminescence blazed brighter than it had in years, so bright that the humans standing near her had to shield their eyes. Beside her, a human soldier sat in the sand, with burns on his arms and blood on his face, and he was laughing, not because anything was funny, but because he was alive, and the people he had fought for were alive. And sometimes that was the funniest thing in the universe. Lithia reached out with her empathic sense and felt him completely. The exhaustion, the pain, the relief, and beneath it all that impossible, reckless fire that she had come to know so well. She had spent months searching for a word in the Velnari language that described what she felt in humans, and she had never found one because the Velnari had never needed a word for something so irrational, so stubborn, so beautifully pointless as the refusal to give up when giving up was the only logical choice. So she used the human word instead. "Hope," she said softly, and the soldier looked up at her and smiled, and the light from her skin reflected in his eyes like stars. The tribunal convened on neutral ground, a space station in the Thessari system that was older than human civilization, and had seen more history made within its walls than most species would experience in 1,000 lifetimes. The Korvathi collective was brought before a panel of judges representing 14 species, and at the center of that panel sat a Velnari. The irony was deliberate, and it was devastating. Her name was Elder Solheen, and she had been one of the first Velnari to be struck by the hollow tide. She had spent 2 years in the darkness, her empathic gift gone, her mind reduced to silence, her body kept alive by machines, while her people mourned her as if she were already dead. She was there because 3 weeks before the tribunal began, Dr. Marin Holt had done something miraculous. Holt had been working with a team of Thessari geneticists and Velnari biologists on Haven, and together they had cracked the code of the hollow-tide parasite. Not just how it worked, but how to undo it. The cure was elegant in the way that only solutions born from desperation can be. A targeted genetic therapy that dismantled the parasite's hold on the Velnari empathic system one neural pathway at a time, rebuilding what had been erased, like light returning to a room that had been dark for too long. Elder Solheen was the first to receive the treatment, and when her bioluminescence returned, slowly at first, a faint flicker beneath her translucent skin, then brighter, then blazing, every Velnari on Haven felt it through their empathic bonds simultaneously. Lithia was standing in a corridor on the medical platform when it happened, and she gasped and pressed her hand against the wall because the sensation was overwhelming. A single point of light appearing in a darkness that had lasted years, and then spreading, rippling outward through the empathic network, like a stone dropped into still water. Around her, Velnari stopped what they were doing and looked up, and one by one their skin began to glow brighter in response, a chain reaction of light that spread across the entire moon until Haven blazed like a small blue sun. Human observers reported that they could see the change from orbit, the surface of the moon shifting from scattered points of bioluminescence to a continuous field of living light that was visible from space. Admiral Cade watched it from the bridge of the Resolve and said nothing, because some things were too big for words. The cure was administered to the Hollow across Haven and then across Shale Mora and every other world where affected Velnari had been sheltered, and the results were consistent and remarkable. Full restoration of empathic ability in 93% of cases, partial restoration in 6%, and in the remaining 1%, enough recovery that the patients could at least feel the presence of others again, after years of total darkness. Isolation. It was not perfect, and for some the scars would never fully heal, but it was enough. It was more than enough. Elder Solheen sat in the tribunal chamber with eyes that had seen the abyss and come back from it, and her empathic sense reached across the room and felt the Korvathi delegates with a clarity that made them visibly uncomfortable, because they knew that she could feel everything they were trying to hide. The evidence was presented over 3 days. Dr. Holt's genetic analysis, intercepted communications between Korvathi hive nodes discussing the deployment of the parasite, financial records showing the diversion of Korvathi military resources to biological weapons development, and testimony from a Korvathi defector whose individual consciousness had briefly separated from the hive long enough to understand the horror of what his species had done. The verdict was unanimous. The Korvathi collective was found guilty of biological warfare against a sovereign species, conspiracy to commit genocide through the deliberate destruction of a species-defining characteristic, and corruption of the Galactic Concord through systematic deception and manipulation. They were expelled from the Concord permanently, their diplomatic status revoked, their colonies placed under quarantine until a new government could be established that was independent of the hive mind leadership responsible for the attack. It was the harshest sentence ever handed down by a galactic tribunal, and it was delivered by a woman who had been one of its victims. After the verdict, Elder Solheen addressed the chamber, and her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a species that had walked through fire and survived. "We do not hate the Korvathi," she said. "Hatred is a poison that destroys the vessel that carries it. But we will remember, and the galaxy will remember, and no species will ever again believe that vulnerability is an opportunity." Invitation for destruction. In the months that followed, the old Galactic Concord dissolved, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow recognition that the institution had been broken long before the Velnari crisis, and that the crisis had simply made the fractures visible. In its place, a new alliance was formed. Ambassador Elena Vasquez and Ambassador Lithia wrote the founding charter together in a small room on Haven, working through the night, while human coffee and Velnari bioluminescent tea sat cooling on the table between them. They called it the Phoenix Concord, and its founding principle was a single sentence that Vasquez had suggested and Lithia had refined until it carried the weight of everything both species had learned. No species shall be measured by what they offer. Every species shall be protected by what they are. It was simple enough for a child to understand, and radical enough to terrify every politician in the galaxy, became the foundation of a new era. Humanity was given a permanent seat on the Phoenix Concord's High Council, not because they had the largest fleet or the strongest economy, but because the Velnari insisted. And when the other founding species asked why, Lythea explained it in terms that silenced every objection. "We have felt the emotions of every species in this galaxy," she said, "and humanity carries something we have never encountered anywhere else. They are a species divided by war, and scarred by cruelty, and haunted by their own history. And yet, when they found a stranger suffering in the dark, they did not calculate the cost or weigh the benefit. They simply reached out their hand." She paused, and her glow brightened. "The galaxy has many powerful species. It has only one that is powerful enough to be cruel and yet chooses to be kind. That is why they sit on this council, and that is why they always will." Of the Phoenix Concord's peacekeeping force, a new kind of guardian that combined Velnari empathic perception with human strategic resilience. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, because the Velnari still could not fight with their bodies, but they did not need to. An Ashborn peacekeeper could walk into a room full of hostile delegates and within minutes understand every hidden agenda, every secret fear, every unspoken alliance, and then use that understanding to guide the conversation toward resolution, with a skill that bordered on art. Other species began sending their young to train alongside the Ashborn on Haven, and the little ocean moon that had been built as a refugee camp became the most important diplomatic academy in the galaxy. Years passed. The scars healed slowly, the way all deep wounds do, not perfectly, not without marks, but well enough that life could continue and even flourish. Haven grew from a refugee settlement into a thriving world, its oceans full of Velnari cities that glowed beneath the waves, its surface dotted with human towns and mixed communities where children of both species grew up together and thought nothing of it, because to them it had always been this way. Lythea became the most celebrated leader in Velnari history, the woman who had stood in the Concord chamber and begged for help, and received it from the one species no one had expected. She visited the memorial often, a wall on the shore of Haven's largest ocean, carved from living coral that the Velnari had grown, and polished stone that human masons had shaped. And on it were written the names of every being, human and Velnari, who had died during the crisis. There were a lot of names. On a quiet evening, several years after the founding of the Phoenix Concord, Lythea walked to the memorial and found someone already there. Admiral Roshan Cade, retired now, stood before the wall with his hands clasped behind his back in the military posture that he had never been able to shake even after leaving the service. He was old, his hair was white, and his hands shook with a tremor he could not control. And his face carried even more lines than it had when Lythea had first met him. But his eyes were the same, steady and fierce, and carrying that stubborn fire that time could not extinguish. Lythea walked up beside him and stood in silence for a moment, and she could feel his emotions as clearly as she had felt them on the first day. Grief and pride and exhaustion and love, all tangled together in the beautiful, chaotic way that only human emotions could be. She placed a bioluminescent flower against the wall, a bloom from the deep oceans of Haven that glowed with a soft blue light, and would continue to glow for years. He placed a folded earth flag beside it, the old kind, the kind that soldiers carried, worn and faded from being kept in a drawer for too long. "People saved mine," Lythea said quietly. Cade shook his head slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with age but steady with conviction. "Your people reminded mine, why will bother," he said. They stood together as the sun set behind the ocean, casting the sky in shades of gold and violet that reflected off the water, and made the whole world look like it was made of light. Two species, broken and rebuilt, standing side by side at the edge of an alien sea, and behind them, carved into the memorial wall in both human script and Velnari light language, was a phrase that had become the motto of Haven and the Phoenix Concord, and everything that both species had built together, from the ashes of cruelty and indifference. It read simply, "We stayed." Because in the end, that was all it had taken. Not superior technology, not unbeatable military strength, not ancient wisdom or cosmic power. Just the stubborn, foolish, magnificent choice to stay when everyone else left, and that had changed the galaxy forever.